everyone to today's panel, America's Pacific Century, ? I want to underscore that question mark there. It's the title of the panel, U.S.-China Relations. My name is Tina Gerhardt. I co-organized the panel, despite what the program says, more or less together with Lucia Green-Weiskel. And the order is going to be a little different than what's in the program today. Boma is going to speak first, and then I'm going to speak, then Lucia Green-Weiskel is going to speak, and then finally Michael Clare is going to speak. Boma is a PhD candidate at the CUNY Graduate Center, and he's currently writing his dissertation, which considers international relations theories and the rise of China. He received his master's degree from NYU and London School of Economics and Political Science, and his BA from Beijing Normal University in China. His articles have appeared in CEU, Political Science Journal, Journal of U.S.-China Public Administration, Leaders Magazine, and China Review Monthly. And his paper today is entitled China's Search for Peaceful Internationalism in a Liberal Internationalism World.
Excuse me, what is your name again, sir?
Boma.
M.A.?
Last name is M.A., yes.
It's in the program, too. It's on the next page. Left form aligning.
An orphan.
Mm-hmm.
When I told my friend that I'm coming to this left forum for the first time, they say, when did you turn left? I said, well, because my apartment is always in the left side of the stairs. Okay, so this is going to be my PhD dissertation titled China's Search of Peaceful Internationalism vis-a-vis an American liberal world orders. Okay, so we understand now we're living in this world dominated by the U.S. power, but the U.S. was so benign. They always say, well, not like other great powers, we use our power for good wealth. So we are living in this liberal internationalism. Okay, so this is best for the world orders and bring stability and prosperity to the rest of the countries. But since the rise of China actually did a little challenge of this, as you can appear from this media, or even some politician was worried about this because of this size of China's economy and its non-democratic regimes. So the research question will be, will China's rise challenge the liberal international order? And also, is China a reformist power or revisionist challenger to Americans' primacies? And then, what principles should inform Chinese foreign policy, the way China deals with the rest of the world? In international relation series, I think there are at least three basic schools: the realism, the neoliberalism, and also the constructivism. They all have their own theory talking about China's rise and their perception. The realism, I categorize it as China threat school. Okay? Mainly, their argument is a rising China will cause instability by threatening the existing system and dominant powers. Okay? So from that sense, China is not different than this British Empire, this Napoleon's France, this Hitler's Germany, or Stalin's Russian, or even the U.S. So it will always seek to become the number one, even may potentially have a war with the U.S. It's because that's all rising power do. Okay, so the U.S. should be careful about this. Particularly scholar like Jiao Mearsheimer, University of Chicago's. In 2005, he wrote a piece called China's Unpeaceful Rise in the Current History magazine. So he talked about China is not going to rise peacefully, despite they always say it's going to be peaceful, but it's impossible because every state wants to survive, and we're not sure about their intentions, and they possess this tremendous economic and potentially can be transferred to a military capacity. So even China now, the military is much smaller than us, but soon they will develop their military power and will challenge us. So we should be careful about this. So that's the realism perception about the rise of China. But they have their problem. First, they suffer this problem in theory. First, they focus too much on this geopolitics, okay, but ignore much of this geoeconomics, right? Because the 21st century is a century of economics more important than others. Okay, so the concept of security has been changed. Before, it was only military security, but now we have these economic securities, these environmental securities, and even human security. Let's say deal with the AIDS of global poverty. So those things are beyond this military capacity, right? So that's one part in the theory. Okay, so this you can really cooperate with other powers. Second, they shot on these empirical examples. For the work has been done by David Kang at the University of South California and James Xiong at NYU. They're talking about China is not the first time rising power. So you cannot draw the analogy between China and these previous great powers. Because from the 6th century to 1820, China was the largest economy in the world. And then you look at their record back to this 1,000 years ago, they didn't really conquer other nations. They didn't conquer their neighbors, right? So David Kang found only 3 wars China had with the neighbors during those 1,000 years. One with Japan and Vietnam, and there a small war with Korea. So mainly it's peaceful. You didn't see China actually conquer other countries back to them. Also, even now, the professor called Fragel at MIT, he conducted China's border dispute with other neighboring countries. So his finding is among 22 border dispute between China and its neighboring country, China only used force 7 times. So most of the time, China just talk with their neighbors. So they showed on these empirical examples. The second school follow this neoliberalism. I call them the engagement school. They say, well, yes, China is rising, and maybe sooner it will surpass or become the largest economy. However, the rise of China benefit from the current geoeconomic state of affairs, and China has followed the rules and norms established by the Western countries. So actually, we make the rules, right? So we make the UN, the Bretton Woods system. So China just become a player. But even if the economy surpasses us, we still make the rule, and they follow our rules. So we shouldn't be terrified about them. So in that sense, China is a stakeholder rather than a challenge to the status quo of the current international system. That's probably, at least you heard people from the White House are talking about the same thing. So China, we shouldn't be afraid of them. We should cooperate with them, engage with them. Eventually, they'll be like us. Okay. The Chinese scholar also say the same thing. They invent this term called peaceful rising. Okay. So yes, we are rising, but we are peaceful, and we have a peaceful development policy. So don't be afraid of us. We will only bring goods to the international system. There are also problems on this perspective. This economic perspective doesn't fully explain why further integration and engagement have not taken place. Right? For instance, if you're talking about you can engage China and play our rules, then how can you explain China refused to join this group of 7, most industrialized country in the world? Russia didn't hesitate to join despite its economy size smaller than China. But China always said this is a rich country club. We're not going to join this. So, okay, but after 2008 financial crisis, Obama proposed to the Chinese leader that let's form a group of 2, right? So China and the U.S. together, we can dominate world affairs. But Chinese once again refused that. So why the Chinese refuse to become the number 2 in the world? I think the Russians probably will do that, right?
They believe in I Ching.
Right. Also, in this territorial sovereignties, China always say, well, Tibet and Taiwan is part of us. We can even use force to defend our territory. All on this issue on human rights, China is also very affirmative. So that's the problem for this engagement school. So engagement only to a certain level, but not further. The last school followed the constructivism approach because they say the Western civilization is so-called standards of civilization. So if we like beef, so we think everyone else in the world like beef, so we'll give them beefs. But this approach said ideas and norms in international relations study, they matters, and they call for return of the historical foundation of the East Asia and China in understanding the security behavior of a rising China. Right? Because China is different. So for the 1,000 years in history, there's not anarchy. It's hierarchy. With China in the center, other countries just align with China, and China provides security to them. Right? So for the Chinese concept, the world is always have some center, and it's a hierarchy. Right? It's like a domestic politics, but doesn't mean China is going to bully the other small states. Right? In fact, before the system was called tribute system, which means the smaller neighbors gave tribute to China, and the Chinese emperor always returned a bigger gift to them. So this system is stable, and if the Chinese has that mentality, they wouldn't mind to become bandwagoning with the U.S. They can tolerate the U.S. in the top, because the U.S. provides security and peace, so China was quite happy about this. That's the third school, but they also have their problem because they gave insufficient attention to change in China's self-perception and identity during the 100 years of semi-colonialism and humiliation from the middle 18th centuries to the middle 19th centuries. Okay, so you were talking about the history, but since 1840 and to 1940, China was becoming the bottom of the world. Was conquered by all this Western power, even by the Portuguese and the little Belgians. Okay, so what identity China has developed through these 100 years of humiliation? Well, you perceive other power the same when it was in the top. Okay, this question they didn't answer. And second is, what has the communism regime changed China's identity since Chairman Mao founding this People's Republic of China, right? So they didn't really talk about the identity change. So I believe that China's re-rising, okay, it's not the first time rise, it's actually a re-rising. It's a comeback case, that's what I want to say. It's too complicated to use a single approach to explain. So analytical framework is needed to better account for China's foreign policy behavior during its resurgence. Right. So I developed this theory called peaceful internationalism. Okay. I argue that China pursue a policy of peaceful internationalism in American-led liberal international order consistent with its national identity. So how should I define peaceful internationalism? It's both ideas and a policy aimed at a cross-national framework for cooperation and interchange through non-conflictual, non-hegemonic, and non-unilateral mechanism of dispute resolution. Okay, here you see we share some similarity between my peaceful internationalism and liberal internationalism in terms of the cooperation and interchange, but they have some difference. First, China look for these non-conflictuals. Here, the U.S. believe democratic countries should be mainly peace because we shouldn't fight a war, but we should fight a war with non-democratic countries so we can promote democracy and human rights to other countries. Okay, then it can be war, but this war is justified. So it's just a war. So we should probably sometime do this war to bring greater peace and prosperity for the world. And the U.S. didn't hesitate to say we want to be a hegemon, okay? But we are a benign hegemon, okay? So we are using our good powers. But China said we will never want to be a hegemonic positions, okay? And China doesn't believe this unilateralism can dispute this conflict. But the U.S. sometimes believe, well, we can just go alone, right? If the cooperation fails. So how do I explain China's peaceful internationalism? I use China's identity. Right, that follow the same analogy of the liberal internationalism. So why the U.S. practice liberal internationalism? It's because the U.S. believe the democracy, right? They believe democratic institutions abroad, domestic, so they want to extend to abroad. Also, they share the value of universality, of democratic value, and respect for human rights. And then they will practice those ideas into extra policy. So why the Chinese should be exception? So I think the Chinese also has their identity. What should I call them? I named them Phoenix Rising identity. So from this Phoenix rising from the ash. Okay? Before they were in the top, then in the bottom, then it's a rise again. So there are three periods consist to this Phoenix Rising identity. One is the Confucian identity shaped by China's glory past from the 700s to 1800s as the dominant state in Asia. So they have this Confucian identity. And then second is what I call the victimhood identity from the ashes of defeat and decline from the middle 18th century to middle 19th. So China was the victimhood. Okay. The third one is the identity of revolutionary internationalism. So during Mao's era from 1940s to 1970s. So how do we understand this victimhood identity? Well, I will say China will probably bring empathy to the underdogs. That's very contradict to the Western thinking, because the Western thinking followed by Florida, they always believe if we were bullied by others, then we want to bully others when we become strong, right? Called the victimhood. But the Chinese think differently. They say if we bully by the strong power, when we become the strong power, we don't want to do the same thing to others, a small states, because we suffer, we hurt, we know it's bad, and we don't want to do the same, right? But we will stand formally against those former imperialism powers, right? You cannot do this to us again, right? For instance, China is very formed on this issue with Japan in this territorial dispute, because you cannot just think you can use the gunboat politics on us. So every time the U.S. try to bully China, China will fight affirmatively. Yeah, so you can use this victim identity. So I believe all China's identity can prevail only under the stability of the current world system, in which the United States is still the dominant powers. So in that sense, China is not trying to overthrow the system, because China is a benefactor of the system as well. It brings stabilities and largely it's peace and this free trade, free market. China all like this. But the problem is that China wants to amend the system, because the current system was set up without China's participation, right? So now China wants to amend the system, right, to bring another voice there. So that's my theory, but maybe you say, oh, this is just something you meant. So is it true? I did 3 case studies to demonstrate my theory. Because of the time constraint, I just briefly talk about this so you can think if that's true. First is this North Korea nuclear crisis since 2003. Okay. So we know North Korea wants to develop a nuclear weapon, then it seems there will be a conflict between the US and the Koreans. And then actually George W. Bush invited China to become the broker to start this 6-party talk. Think about this. If China thinks like Stalin's Russian, will China help the U.S. to balance North Korea? Probably not. Okay, China probably will use North Korea to balance the U.S., to further weaken the U.S. Or even you don't think as Stalin's Russian, at least you are not going to help the U.S., right, to broke the peace talk. So why China help the U.S. to broke the peace talk, right? So my theory can explain that. Second is China's foreign aid policy towards sub-Saharan Africa. Here always, China go for oil, China go for resources. That's no different from other great powers. So it's a new imperialism, a new colonialism there. But China also gave foreign aid to those countries. But China gave foreign aid to every country, no matter you have resource or no resource. Okay. So if you say China go there for resource, why Chinese gave the foreign aid to those countries they don't have any resource there, right? So my theory can also explain this. Third one is China's policy towards the nuclear disarmament policy. So if you're talking about China is prepared for a war with the U.S., then why Chinese are so passionate about start this nuclear disarmament talk with the U.S.? It was actually the U.S. don't want to reduce its nuclear weapon, and China only have 200 nuclear head, but they still say we want to discuss this cut our nuclear capacity. So if you think China is prepared for this war with the U.S. or want to challenge the U.S., why China want to cut its own nuclear weapon, but it was the U.S. didn't want to cut? Okay, so if you combine these three, I think you will find the current theory about China have their deficit. So I think it's time for us to think new about the behavior of rising China and use some theory. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Bo. I think that sets the stage very well, sort of to give us a broad context of China's rise in the context of international relations theory. And I'm speaking now because our next speaker is our moderator, and I'm going to introduce her. Tina Gerhardt, who is an independent journalist. She's written about climate change negotiations at the United Nations, and also about direct action protests and so on that have happened outside those protests. She writes about energy policy and climate negotiations and is an expert on energy policy in the U.S. Her work has appeared in Alternet, Grist, In These Times, The Progressive, The Nation, and most recently also the Wall Street Journal. And she's appeared on Laura Flanders' show on Grit TV, and also on Pacifica Radio's KPFA, Against the Grain, and also Wake Up Call from WBAI here in New York, as well as on National Public Radio. So she is currently a professor in the University of Hawaii. So she has flown all the way from Hawaii to be with us today. And are you a little
Good
jet
morning.
lagged?
It's 6:30 in my world.
She's like, yeah, but she is powering through this. It's a real honor to be on this panel with Tina. We have co-written a few articles before on U.S. and China climate negotiations and the Hu Jintao and Barack Obama summit last January. We read about that as well. And we actually met in Cancun for the UN, the COP16, the UN climate change conference down there. So, Tina Gerhardt.
Thanks, Lucia. Kind, generous introduction and waking me up. Good morning, world. Yeah, it's Lucia's interest in China that actually, aside from being in Hawaii, has really done a lot to bring my focus to the region. And I'm by no means as much of a China scholar as some of my co-panelists. I'll just put that out there right off the bat. I was in Hawaii because I'm assistant professor there during the Apec summit, which took place last fall, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit and how it ties in with Asia's Pacific Century ? In November 2011, President Obama and Secretary of State Hillary Clinton made the Pacific region the focus of their foreign policy by hosting the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation APEC summit in Honolulu, Hawaii. By following the summit with a 10-day Pacific tour, including stops en route by President Obama in Australia and by Clinton in the Philippines and Thailand, and then subsequently by stopping off at the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN, and the East Asia Summit in Bali, Indonesia. Well in advance of these visits, Clinton had laid out the importance of the transatlantic region for the 21st century in an article that she published in Foreign Policy in October 2011. If you Google search it, you can just come to the PDF, entitled America's Pacific Century. And she gave this article in abbreviated form as a talk at the University of Hawaii the day before the APEC summit kicked off. I had a chance to hear it there. President Obama and Secretary of State Clinton's trip and the attendant economic free trade agreements, as well as the announcement of an increase in 2,500 boots on the ground in Australia, can be read as signs of a major geopolitical shift in Obama's foreign policy. The Asia-Pacific region continues to increase in might. Witness China's offer to bail out the EU last fall, and this is an offer that continues, which I think is a really big sign of shifts. And President Obama is well attuned to these geopolitical shifts. Established in 1989 in the face of perceived collapse of communism, the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation APEC summit brings together 21 Pacific Rim economies each year seeking to promote free trade in the Asia-Pacific region. For people in the region, the fact that it's rim economies and not basin economies is also very crucial. Together, the 21 member economies account for over half, 54 to be exact, of global GDP. They account for 58% of U.S. goods consumed and form almost half, 43% of world trade. 7 of the U.S.'s top 15 trade partners are located in the APEC region. So these are all reasons for President Obama's focus on the region. President Obama seeks to use APEC as a vehicle to establish a free trade agreement for the Asia-Pacific region. As most of us attending this panel probably know, a wide variety of things get impacted by FTAs. They've been typically detrimental to local independent businesses, to farmers, to fishers, and so on. FTAs also trump policies promoting locally grown food, impacting farmers trying to sell their produce and consumers trying to purchase it at farmers markets, as well as native plants, seeds, crops. And I want to make a tie, and I think Left Forum's a good place to do that, between NAFTA, which was ratified under President Bill Clinton in 1994, so that Democrats also are seen in their true light as being ones that promote free trade agreements and neoliberal policies. Under NAFTA, ratified under Bill Clinton in 1994, Mexico's laws protected things like the traditional maize or corn that had been grown in many regions of Mexico for thousands of years, which then had to submit to NAFTA's terms. As a result, tons of excess U.S. corn saturated the Mexican market, competing with crops of local farmers. One can also think of Monsanto being able to bring in GMO seeds to Mexico, and those threatening the rich biodiversity of Mexico's native seed stock. Other laws that get trumped by FTAs include human rights laws, zoning laws, environmental laws, labor laws, health laws. In Japan, New Zealand, they're very concerned about subsidized medicine. An FTA in the Pacific region would trump subsidized medicine programs that they currently have in place. This turn to the Pacific region, contrary to what some might believe, is not new for the Obama administration, and President Obama has sought agreements to benefit from the Asia-Pacific region since the very outset of his presidency. A harbinger of things to come, one could read the chorus, the Korea-U.S. Free Trade Agreement, as a sign of what, on a bigger scale, the APEC summit is trying to implement. On February 10th, 2011, the United States and South Korea signed 2 agreements that were amendments to the Korea-U.S. Free Trade Agreement, and they were ratified on June 30th, 2007. These agreements, which are the most significant the U.S. has signed in over 16 years since NAFTA, and there's that connection between President Clinton's policies and President Obama's, Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, I think, playing a crucial role there. And the sort of neoliberal agendas that the Democratic presidents have been pushing forward through their FTAs. These agreements, the most significant the U.S. has signed in over 16 years since NAFTA, reduce Korean tariffs on U.S. goods exported to Korea. They were approved by Congress on October 12, 2011. On November 23, 2011, the Korean National Assembly ratified the agreement, however, not without considerable opposition, as a parliamentarian set off a tear gas inside the parliament to protest the decision to bring the FTA to a vote with little notice given to parliamentarians in an attempt to squelch dissenting votes. So they just kind of threw it on the agenda without really notifying the parliamentarians. And this week, despite the complete lack of any corporate media coverage in the U.S. of this situation in Korea, there are widespread protests because it was just implemented this week, this Course Free Trade Agreement. They also implemented it on March 15th, which is a heavily laden day with significance, anniversaries, Syrian uprisings, etc. But they implemented on March 15th, which is interesting in that free trade agreements typically get implemented on the first of a month because it makes accounting much more easy, because all of the math anything that has to be calculated, taxes, anything, is easier to do on the first of a month than somewhere in the middle of a month. They passed it in the middle of the month because Korea has elections coming up, and they're very concerned that the people who are going to be in power in the parliament in Korea are going to be people who are in the majority opposed to the FTA. And this is something the U.S. pushed Korea to do, to implement it much earlier. Ron Kirk, U.S. Trade Representative, stated that, quote, under the FTA, nearly 95% of bilateral trade in consumer and industrial products will become duty-free within 5 years, and most remaining tariffs would be eliminated within 10 years, end quote. Additionally, the Chorus Free Trade Agreement would allow greater access to the Korean financial market. Quote, as the first U.S. FTA with a North Asian partner, Kirk continued, the Chorus FTA is a model for free trade agreements for the rest of the region, which is why I bring it in here, and underscores the U.S. commitment to an engagement in the Asia-Pacific region, end quote. In other words, the Chorus FTA is a harbinger of things to come. Christine Ahn, executive director of the Korea Policy Institute, told me in an interview that, quote, the proposed Chorus FTA undermines South Korean democracy in significant ways. It undermines, to be precise, approximately 180 South Korean laws, end quote. In particular, she continued, the Chorus FTA has two really negative effects. First, in the pharmaceutical industry, which I mentioned just a moment ago, and second, in the agricultural arena. Korea has a universal health care system. While it is not like Sweden's health care system by any means, it does provide basic health care for everyone. And as part of it, Korea has a strong generic pharmaceutical industry. Concerns abound that the Chorus FTA would drive up costs so much that universal health care would be untenable and Korean health care would be essentially privatized. The FTA would also negatively impact agriculture. Ahn said, as anyone who has followed the World Trade Organization knows, Korean farmers have been intensely affected by their policies, end quote. And one could just think here of the 2003 WTO meeting in Cancun, where a Korean farmer committed suicide at the barricades in order to indicate the desperate situation of Korean farmers as a result of the WTO's policies. Quote, the Chorus FTA would deepen this impact, Ahn stated. According to the Korean government's own figures, 45% of Korean farmers would be displaced from their farms because they would not be able to compete with the U.S. subsidized agricultural industry. We have already seen this type of effect of FTAs in Mexico under NAFTA. Connecting the dots, Australia-U.S. FTA. Like the Chorus FTA, the U.S.-Australia Free Trade Agreement was passed before Obama took office, but augmented during his tenure, and again with the intention to increase free trade in the Pacific region. It was passed January 1st, 2005, intensified in 2009, when bilateral working groups were established to facilitate agricultural trade. So I read the visit to Australia not only as the corporate media represented it as putting more boots on the ground, which it certainly did, but also as an attempt to intensify free trade in the area. Announcing the U.S.-Australia FTA, the Office of U.S. Trade Representative Ron Kirk laid bare the relationship between these bilateral and planned multilateral agreements. And I want to underscore that bilateral agreements are taking place more now because of the failure of the WTO, of the Doha round of talks, which a lot of leftists, in my estimation, rightly so, claim as a victory for themselves in really calling attention to the WTO, protesting consistently its policies at its annual meetings, underscoring the negative effects that FTAs have had and continue to have, and that now these agreements can only really be rammed through at a bilateral level, which is not to say that there aren't heads of state that are also not participating in multilateral agreements for a variety of reasons. But there is also movement from below on the ground in these particular countries that are impacted, as well as sort of an international, whatever you want to call it, globalization, anti-capitalist movement that is working together to make that happen. So the U.S. Trade Representative laid bare the relationship between these bilateral and the planned multilateral agreements as it continued, as Kirk stated, quote, in September 2008, the United States announced its intention to begin negotiations to join the Trans-Pacific Strategic Economic Partnership Agreement, also known as the Trans-Pacific Partnership, or TPP. The Trans-Pacific Partnership. President Obama, during his first visit to Asia in November 2009, underscored his commitment to the Trans-Pacific Partnership, or TPP, which is a multilateral free trade agreement seeking to liberalize the economies of the Asia-Pacific region, or, quote, to serve as a vehicle for trans-Pacific economic integration. In a letter sent to Congress on December 14, 2009, Ron Kirk stated that that President Obama joined the TPP, quote, with the objective of shaping a high-standard, broad-based regional pact. Apec seeks to pave the way for the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which is essentially a free trade agreement of the Asia-Pacific region. President Bill Clinton hosted the first Apec summit in 1993, again that lineage, a year before NAFTA was passed on Blake's Island and Puget Sound. The proposed TPP thus emerged in the heyday of FTAs, but also out of the stalled WTO Doha talks. ASEAN, the summit that I mentioned previously, initially opposed the establishment of APEC and the TPP, proposing an East Asian Economic Caucus instead, one that notably excluded the United States, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. So there is, in my estimation, but I think my co-panelists could probably say a lot more about this, in my understanding of it, there is also a competition of sorts between ASEAN, if I understand it correctly, and this attempt through APEC to establish a Trans-Pacific partnership. Again, I could be wrong on that. APEC's members are member economies, they're not nation states, which allows Taiwan to participate as Chinese Taipei, et cetera. There's a couple of other, if one goes through the lists along those lines. Meetings that attempt to employ the Trans-Pacific Partnership have taken place parallel to the APEC summit since 2002. It was signed in 2005 and implemented in 2006, and it currently includes Brunei, Chile, New Zealand, and Singapore. Australia, Malaysia, Peru, the United States, and Vietnam are negotiating to join, and the first step to formalize the TPP would really, as a regional trade agreement, would be really to set in place some formal architecture for this. And this is something Obama has set as a goal for APEC to achieve by next year's APEC meeting, which is taking place in Vladivostok, Russia, from September 2nd to 9th of 2012. Canada, Japan, and the Philippines, South Korea, and Taiwan have also expressed interest in joining the TPP. And Clinton's subsequent trip to the Philippines, which again had a military component, but I think could also be read as trying to booster some support for them to join the TPP. Let's see, time. The 1997 economic meltdown in Southeast Asia. So before just before the summit, the APEC summit started, Japan's Prime Minister Noda announced interest in joining the TPP. In response to his decision, 6,000 demonstrators protested in Tokyo, and he was left arriving and sort of backpedaling. And the reason for that is the TPP would deeply impact farmers, especially rice and wheat farmers, since it would erase these kinds of tariffs on grains that I mentioned it had already done for Mexico, allowing Australia, the United States, and Vietnam to import cheaper grains to Japan. And I think one of the things that's playing a role in protests against the TPP or against APEC on the ground and against just FTAs in general, Korea with these uprisings going on right now, is that the meltdown of 1997 is really seared into people's minds in the region there. And countries that were most affected by this 1997 Asian financial crisis were Indonesia, South Korea, and Thailand, as well as Japan, Laos, Malaysia, and the Philippines. And typical of these kinds of meltdowns, the IMF offered loans. Typically, they were tied to having to, in a neoliberal way, realign the economy. There were also tariffs were abolished on imports as this economic reintegration took place. So these are some of the concerns that people have about this proposed TPP. In an attempt to drum up support for the TPP, President Obama and Secretary of State Clinton, as I mentioned, traveled on to the East Asia Summit in Bali, Indonesia, which takes place in conjunction with the ASEAN Summit. The ASEAN Summit consists of 15 nations plus China, South Korea, and Japan. They met in November of last year. India and Australia have also signed on. And this year, last fall, Russia and the US attended for the first time as observers. ASEAN has already established free trade agreements internal to the zone, so this is why, to some extent, I view it as being in competition with the TPP. And then, as I mentioned, Secretary of State Hillary Clinton traveled on to the Philippines, Thailand, and Indonesia, and these are countries that haven't signed on to the TPP yet. President Obama stepped off en route to Australia, as I mentioned, which is also, I think, an economic push that he's trying for Australia to amp up this bilateral agreement that we have. I would say attempts to bolster TPP face a much further and larger hurdle, though, and that brings us back to the focus of the panel. The U.S. wants nations in the region, in particular China, to lower tariffs imposed on a variety of products. Renewable energy is one of them, and we saw just this last week President Obama announcing that the U.S. is going to take a case against China to the World Trade Organization for restricting access to its rare earth minerals. China has about 95% of the world's rare earth minerals, and some of them are really vital for things like cell phones or electric car batteries. So I think the combination of these visits en route, which established or reaffirmed the U.S.'s military might in the region, in order to bolster its economic interests, have been read from the vantage point of the U.S. as a shift in foreign policy from the Middle East to the Asia-Pacific region. That's the narrative that was told in the media quite often, vis-a-vis economic, military, political interests. Some argue that reading from the vantage point of nations in the region, it's actually much more of a continuation of a standing 60-year post-World War II U.S. policy towards the Asia-Pacific region in general, and China in particular, that completely predates the Obama administration. Thanks for your time. So Lucia Green-Weiskel is a PhD candidate at the CUNY Graduate Center, and she's working on a dissertation about post-World War II U.S.-China economic, military, environmental, and political relations. She's also communications director at the Beijing-based NGO Innovation Center for Energy and Transportation. Her work has appeared in Alternet, China Dialogue, Grist, Huffington Post, The Nation, and the New York Times. She's been interviewed on Democracy Now!, WNYC's Brian Lair's show, Doug Henwood's Behind the News, and This American Life. And her paper today is entitled U.S.-China Relations, Energy, and Climate Change.
Thanks, Tina. Okay. Thanks. Well, it's really great to be here today. And as Tina mentioned, I wear a number of hats, and primarily two. One is as a student and completing my PhD on U.S.-China relations more broadly, looking at climate change and energy policy as one case study within the broader U.S.-China relations. I'm actually not going to talk about that work today. I'm going to talk instead using my Innovation Center for Energy and Transportation hat. We are an NGO that's based in Beijing, and I've been working with them for the past 5 years. The last couple of years I've been here in New York since I've been doing my studies and also working at the same time. And we work on transportation policy and climate change policy, and have done a lot of work bridging the U.S. and China, sort of helping mutual understanding between two countries in the context of the United Nations and the climate change talks, first in Copenhagen, Cancun, and then Durban last year. And also exchanging best practices, so looking at sort of what policies really work on energy and climate policy and how we can implement them in both countries in ways that are economically, politically, socially, culturally appropriate for each country. So we've done a lot of work on that. So I think my talk fits in actually really well as I was listening to the previous panelists. I think I will be talking about U.S.-China relations in the context of kind of broader IR theory, although I won't use the same words that Bo used, but still sort of the big question is really what Bo laid out, is how do we understand China's rise? And China's rise has many different components, one of which is its increasing appetite for resources. As it becomes a larger economy, it is demanding more resources and more energy, and that creates a competition source of tension with the United States, which is also demanding a lot of resources. And of course, that tension surfaces in the area of trade, which is what Tina was talking about, and I'll talk about that a little bit as well. And of course, we have the expert on resource wars, Michael Clare, who wrote a book by that name, and a new book that's on the scramble for the resources that are left to round up the panel in the end. So I am actually not going to be talking about competition for resources. I will be talking about a different type of competition that's related to competition for resources, and that's competition for space in the atmosphere to pollute. So it's a slightly more abstract concept, but I think equally important. And what I mean by that, of course, is greenhouse gas emissions associated with the burning of fossil fuels. We know that there's a finite amount of greenhouse gases that the atmosphere can absorb, and the U.S. and China, as I see it, are competing for space, for room, for political acceptance, and for permission, in some cases not asking permission, to take up that space. I understand the atmosphere to be sort of the ultimate commons. It is something that we all share. The atmosphere ignores national boundaries. You don't have the Chinese part of the atmosphere. You don't have an American part of the atmosphere. You don't have a French part of the atmosphere. You just have one atmosphere. And also it functions like a stew, meaning that when you polluted one area, it can affect parts of the globe that are on the other, the other side of the globe. And so we really are all in this together. There's a lot of kind of these cliche terms that I think actually are quite appropriate. We have one Earth, and we are all, in this together. This is our problem that we need to share. So we have to get over the political hurdles that Bo mentioned, and we have to get over the trade disputes and the issues of competition between the US and China to be able to solve this problem. So that's my mindset in looking at this. And I just wanted to make 3 points, and then of sort of how I see it from my experience of working with China. And again, I've had this great opportunity of working with a Chinese organization. So as I am clearly not Chinese and have spent quite a bit of time in China, but still, I think that I've had a pretty good experience of working inside the Chinese government and also working with this NGO in China. So that's where I come from. So first, I'm going to look at sort of these different areas where the U.S. and China have potentially different ways of viewing the energy and climate crisis. The first is that the two countries have two opposing models, and this is kind of like their worldview, the big picture. The second is how that worldview is implemented in practice, and there I'm going to look at the race over development of clean technology, and also the trade disputes. And then third, I will make an attempt to kind of look at some of the philosophical differences, the ways that the two countries look at the climate energy problems in a very different light, as I've seen it, and how sometimes that creates a situation where it's almost like two people who they're just not talking in a way that is conducive to cooperation, because they're not understanding, they're looking at different terms. So that's kind of a philosophical standpoint, and I'll make a few points about that. Okay, so two opposing models. China is run by a communist party. The U.S. is a democracy, we know that. China is run primarily by engineers. Most of the top officials in the Politburo have engineering degrees. The U.S. is mostly run by lawyers. So there's that difference. China is a developing country, which means that although it's becoming increasingly more developed and increasingly more wealthy, that means that the country sort of has the benefit of not being too entrenched in the fossil fuel economy. Now, I say that very carefully because, in fact, that's changing, and it's becoming more and more entrenched. There is, just like the United States, there's becoming a automobile and oil lobby, that is affecting policies in China, just like we have in the U.S. So alas, this is less and less true, and coal and oil is really dominating both the political scene and also China's international politics. In the U.S. is a developed country, and we are very much entrenched in this fossil fuel economy, so it's harder to retract out of that and to make the changes. China has the benefit, the opportunity to create a new model. So we have to ask the question, are we seeing that happen? I'm not sure that we are, but I think there's some elements that we are seeing happening, and that's a good sign. Also, China really is forced to deal with the climate change problem more seriously than we are in the United States. There's been incidents of social unrest in China that are associated with land grab and environmental degradation. People are angry, they are showing it on the streets. This is threatening to the government. They need to deal with it. They have more people who live in poverty and are living more closely to the environment, are more vulnerable to weather events and things like that. People living on, in shacks on the side of riverbeds. In the U.S., we can afford, and in fact are basically ignoring climate change. The wealthy can buy themselves out of environmental problems. They can build better dikes. They can buy other houses. They can move. And I think, and I would argue that we have an attitude where the poor, who are more vulnerable to climate change, Americans, I believe, have sort of this cultural view that it's their own fault for not succeeding and not sort of achieving the American dream. So therefore, we're not responsible for the people, the victims of Hurricane Katrina. The people who we see are really vulnerable to weather and environmental degradation. So we can ignore it, and in fact we are. The Republicans, as you know, are launching sort of this war on science and really ignoring climate change altogether. China can't afford to do that. In general, the legislative process, another key point of difference in terms of the models between the US and China. In the US, legislation passes, it takes a very long time to pass, but when it does, the implementation is very strong. In China, policies are passed very quickly, overnight sometimes. A bunch of people meet in a room, they come out and they're like, this is what we're going to do. But implementation takes a very long time and is often very weak. That's a key difference. And also in some cases, the data is not good. So if you see a province, the official data may be that they've reduced their carbon intensity by X amount. Well, sometimes that's not always the case. Whereas in the US, data is slightly more reliable, at least I've found as a researcher working in the two countries. And then the drivers for greenhouse gas emissions are quite different. In China, greenhouse gas emissions are driven primarily by exports, products that China is making for the benefit for sale to other countries. In the US, greenhouse gas emissions is driven by domestic consumption, by large homes, by excessive use of air conditioning, by holiday travel, by large cars, by diet, carbon-intensive diets like a lot of meat. China is definitely moving in that direction, but isn't there yet. So those are two ways in which the two countries just represent different models. And then how do those models, where do they sort of hit the road? How do we see those models in practice? And this I'm just going to focus on clean energy and the race between the US and China on developing clean technology. Tina and I wrote an article called The New Sputnik. Is that what it was called? The Sputnik Moment, which was a phrase that we stole from Secretary Stephen Chu about the US and China's competition, comparing it to the US and USSR competition over the space race, saying that this is sort of the new frontier, who's going to win. And for a while it really seemed like China was winning. China, through many programs of subsidies and government investment, central planning and aggressive government investment, has managed to become one of the largest exporters of solar panels and wind turbines. China produced 50% of the world's wind turbines and has 60% of the photovoltaic manufacturing capacity. But about 95% of those solar panels are exported, so China is not implementing them. Instead, they're exporting them abroad. But certainly, they're becoming the manufacturer of clean technology. But I would argue, and then this from the New York Times in 2010, so 2 years ago, more than 3 times as much wind power capacity was installed in China than in the United States. So China is really taking leaps and bounds. But then now jump forward a year, 2011, suddenly U.S. clean energy investments moved back ahead of China for the first time since 2008. This is more recent studies coming out. So it is really a horse race. Before it really looked like China was winning, dominating the clean tech scene. Now the U.S. is coming back. The U.S. has been very unhappy about China's way of getting ahead in the clean technology race, namely issuing subsidies and other material benefits, such as massive cash grants, discounted raw material, discounted land, power and water, preferential loans, tax exemptions, export assistance grants, and all those things that can help fledgling renewable energy companies in China do better. And there's been a number of ways in which, a number of incidents when that tension has surfaced. So one is what Tina mentioned, the dispute over rare earth minerals, where the U.S. lodged a complaint with the Obama administration. Also, and just next week we'll hear the verdict on this, I can't remember the name, a solar panel company also lodged a complaint with the U.S. trade representatives that China is unfairly dumping cheap solar panels and messing with the U.S. market. And then in 2010, the Steelworkers Union filed a complaint also with the U.S. trade representatives about wind turbines coming from China. And so again, the complaints are that Chinese companies are being unfairly the recipient of these subsidies. But in fact, and this is a much more detailed argument than I could go into right now, and it's something that I've written about and spent a lot of time working on. Many of these measures that we're accusing China of doing, many of these subsidies, actually exist in very similar forms in the United States. We do the same thing, basically. And if you're on the side of the earth if you're on the side of the environment, you have to say that these industries need subsidies. Now that's my opinion, and I think, and Tina and I wrote about this, this is what we argued, was that basically, yes, there is a way in which China's subsidies is hurting U.S. solar power, but in the industry in general, it's helping the industry. It's creating, China is the only country that really has the ability to create green technology on mass scale and make it affordable for not just Americans, but for the developing world. Places that are buying this stuff and really need to have it in an affordable way right now. Again, this is a very complicated debate, and I'll stop there because it gets, I think, but I just wanted to point out that that's the tension, and those are the areas where that tension has sort of ruptured to the surface. One last point that I would point out is that while China is surging ahead as a manufacturer, it's really lagging behind as an owner of intellectual property. One study that we recently did on electric vehicles showed that China actually owns only 1% of the patents on lithium-ion batteries, which is the key component for electric vehicles. The U.S. owns 22, Japan owns 50. So it's really not this world where China is dominating completely. There are trends towards that, but that's not what's happening right now. Also, in terms of actual, I found this interesting, in terms of actual consumption of renewable energy, the U.S. uses, the U.S.'s total electricity, about 3.5% of its total electricity comes from renewable sources. In China, that number is less than 1%. So China isn't really bringing renewable energy online in the way that we might imagine when we hear, China becoming the green tech, giant that's sort of taking over the world. That's not quite happening right now. And also, an interesting point on electric vehicles, I just wrote a report for the United Nations on this, which found that, yes, China is producing a lot of electric vehicles, and they're taking off, in many ways not as much as was predicted. There's a lot of scaling back of targets, especially in southern China. But we found that when an electric vehicle is driven in China, because the electric vehicle pulls energy from the grid, and the grid is so heavily dependent on coal, that actually an electric vehicle in all but 3 of the 7 provinces in China actually has a higher greenhouse gas footprint than its counterpart in an internal combustion engine vehicle. So that sounds like I'm saying electric vehicles are bad, and I am not. I'm saying that you need to have the electric vehicle technology, but it needs to be paired with smart grid reform, bringing renewable energy into the grid. So we wrote that article, we pitched it to the government in China, and we'll see what happens. Okay, the last section, I make an attempt to sort of get at sort of the philosophical differences between the U.S. and China in terms of looking at this energy and climate crisis. China is the largest emitter of greenhouse gases in the world on a nation-state production basis. It overtook the U.S. in 2007, many years ahead of predictions, and could emit twice the amount of emissions as the U.S. does in 2030. So it's this kind of line we're looking at, going way up. But on a historic basis, most of the emissions that are in the atmosphere now, so I said the atmosphere is like a stew. It's like a stew with a long memory, right? Nothing leaves, so everything stays there. Most of the emissions that are in the atmosphere now are from the U.S. and Europe and their respective industrial revolutions, not from China. Also, on a per capita basis, the U.S. is still a much larger emitter of greenhouse gas emissions than China. And then there's also this tricky question of carbon leakage, which basically is that about a quarter, and again, actually this is old data, and I haven't been able to update it since 2008, but in 2008, about a quarter of China's greenhouse gas emissions were directly sourced from products that were made for export. So products that were sold to Canada, the US, and Europe primarily. So with that as sort of, China, when you talk to leaders in China, they like to quote these statistics because it shifts a little bit of the pressure off of the US and onto China, off of China and onto the US. And with that as its basis, China has developed this idea that that China should be exempted from international regulations, international legally binding targets that are decided upon at the United Nations. So this is something that came up in Copenhagen as a big issue at the UN talks there, and then the subsequent UN talks as well. It keeps resurfacing. It's a really thorny issue. It won't go away. And China believes that the US and China, the developed countries and developing countries, should have common but differentiated responsibilities. This is the clause that's actually in the official text at the UN. And basically what that means is that all countries should respond to the climate crisis, but to their own, matched with their ability. So developing countries will respond less. Developed countries really need to lead the way. The U.S. rejects this idea and instead believes that a solution needs to have synergy. That's the word that the U.S. officials use, which basically means developing countries need to be doing as much as the U.S. does. We don't want to act alone. We don't want to stick our neck out. This may hurt our economy, and then it won't hurt the developing countries, and the U.S. will lose in competitiveness. And then the other thing is that China is, as a developing country, is still focused on poverty. One statistic that I think is interesting is that 480 million people still live in China on less than $2 a day. So that number is greater than the populations of the U.S., the UK, and Germany combined. So it's really it's a different country, different priorities, different economic model, and we have to sort of look at that when understanding the energy and climate crisis, because of course energy is the essential ingredient to a growing economy. So I don't want to come across as apologizing for, as an apologist for China's behavior, but I think what's crucially important is understanding, really looking at the details, and I see that, that it's sort of woefully lost on the U.S. often in the mainstream media and even in the left media, where this, the nuance of the trade debate is really lost. And with that, I'll end, because I know that we all want to hear Michael Clare talk about resource competition. So thank you very much.
I don't need an
Oh.
Thank you. I also want to give people a chance to raise questions, so I'll try to keep to my 15 minutes, so then you'll have some time. Hello, everyone. And I'm going to examine the new U.S. defense policy, which was first announced in Canberra after the Apec meeting that Tina spoke about on November 17th, and a speech by President Obama in the Australian Parliament, and then on January 5th at the Department of Defense at a press conference releasing a new U.S. defense strategy. And this new defense strategy has three main features. The first is that the center of gravity of of America's strategy will be the Asia-Pacific region, especially the maritime fringe of East Asia, stretching from the Indian Ocean around Southeast Asia, South China Sea, East China Sea, up to Japan, with the South China Sea as the pivot, the crucial area. Second, the principal thrust of this refocusing of American strategy will be naval power. It's aimed at what's called in naval terms the command of the sea, dominance of the sea, and use of the sea, the Indian Ocean and the Pacific, as a position from which to project power, in military terms, onto the Asian mainland. And third, the geopolitical or strategic aim of this strategy is to encircle China on its maritime flanks, to secure control of the sea lines of communication, or SLOC, S-L-O-C, sea lines of communication, on which China depends for its economic life, for importing raw materials and exporting finished goods, so as to exercise ultimate veto power over China's economic survival. This strategy will have enormous significance for the future of the world. It's highly dangerous and risky, and I'll come back to that. But first, let me describe the origins of this strategy briefly. Essentially, it's a response to the strategic dead end of the Bush-era strategy, loosely called the Global War on Terrorism, or GWAT. But it's essentially which essentially was a strategy to project American power into the heart of the Middle East and Central Asia. This strategy proved to be monumentally costly, ultimately unsuccessful, strategically insignificant, and a gift to China, which used America's distraction in Central Asia and Afghanistan to expand its own reach in Southeast Asia and surrounding waters. Now, the U.S. Distraction and quagmire wouldn't have been catastrophic for a superpower in its prime, with an unlimited supply of gold and troops and treasure and other resources. And that certainly was the assumption on which President Bush ordered U.S. forces into Iraq in 2003. But certainly by the end of that period, the USA had possessed none of those things anymore. Its treasury was depleted, its military was exhausted and broken, and its strategy and military will was in total disarray. Now, not everybody in Washington will admit to this assessment, of course, but President Obama and his advisors are pretty candid about this reality and the current limits to American power. And he talks about this in his speeches, Obama does, and on the need for a new strategic vision based on real-world realities, not ideological fantasies. And it appears that last summer or over the past 6 months or so, they conducted somewhere at their retreat in Maryland, wherever, a pretty thorough review of America's strategic predicament in this new period, and came up with a very clear blueprint for preserving America's global dominance in this new era of diminished wealth and resources and more assertive and powerful challengers. And that blueprint, as I indicated, is focused on Asia and the Pacific, and specifically the use of naval power to dominate the critical sea lanes off the south and east coasts of the Asian mainland. This is seen by the Obama administration as a logical, essential response to the fatal defects of the Bush-era strategy. It moves U.S. forces off the ground of Asia and onto the sea, where they can be moved around as necessary for short-term contingencies while avoiding costly, dangerous ground operations, and which provoke tremendous hostility from people in the region. It also maximizes America's greatest strategic advantages, which are air and naval power, which is also the greatest weakness of potential adversaries, which have strong ground forces but lack strong air and naval strength. And it also focuses on a kind of a logical strategic construct, that the dominant fact of the 21st century is globalization. And globalization rests on the movement of goods by the sea around the world, and that whoever controls that movement controls the world's economy. And this, I think, is a much more sellable and sustainable strategy than one based on ideology and an endless war against Muslim fanatics. Finally, it gives the U.S. a powerful advantage against America's greatest potential rival, China, in a realm where China is especially vulnerable. That is, its dependency on imported oil and raw materials, and its need to export manufactured goods to world markets, its reliance on globalization. So this is the essence, I think, of the logic behind the new U.S. strategic blueprint. Now, those of you who have studied American history and American military policy may be struck by the fact that this is not exactly a new strategic perspective. At the end of the 19th century, you have to go back over 100 years, 120 years, to the years before the Spanish-American War, when a band of nascent imperialists led by Theodore Roosevelt and Alfred Thayer Mahan, then the president of the Naval War College in New London, Connecticut, not New London, in Newport, Rhode Island, led a campaign to make America a global power, but specifically a Pacific power, by the annexation of Hawaii, by the defeat of Spain, and the annexation, the appropriation of Spain's Pacific colonies, especially the Philippines and other key islands like Guam, and then the domination of the sea lanes of the Western Pacific, including the South China Sea. This was the blueprint of Theodore Roosevelt and Mahon in the 1890s. This led to the despicable U.S. seizure of Hawaii and the conquest of the Philippines against the resistance of the Filipino people, which led to a horrible counterinsurgency war with the use of torture and concentration camps, the Philippine insurgency. Both of these are the subject of new books which have been very well reviewed in the New York Times. I don't have their titles, but they're probably well worth reading. And to the acquisition of naval bases throughout the region. And domination of the Western Pacific became the primary aim of U.S. strategy from 1900 up until the 1930s, when Japan arose to challenge American dominance in the region. And it was Japan's rise, not Germany's, that provoked American entry into World War II and led to the main thrust of American war power was in the Pacific. And it was a very hard war. After World War II, it also, this goal of dominating the Western Pacific led to the most deadly and costly U.S. wars since World War II in Vietnam and Korea. There have been distractions over this period, the Soviet buildup in Eastern Europe, and the global war on terror, which dominated a lot of military thought for about 50 years, but now we're back to the default in U.S. strategy, which is domination of the Western Pacific and reliance on naval power to assert U.S. dominance. But there's a difference, of course, between now and 1930. Once the greatest challenger was Japan, and Japan proved a very formidable foe. We mustn't forget that. Defeating Japan was no easy matter. They fought ferociously for 5 years, with far more limited resources than the U.S. And don't forget it, we used 2 nuclear weapons to defeat Japan. Today, the U.S. faces a potentially greater challenger than Japan, namely China. China is not an island power, but a mainland power. So it can't be isolated in the same way Japan was. And it has a large population and it's significant domestic natural resources. It also enjoys interior lines of communication to Central Asia, Southeast Asia, and Russia. So it has some advantages that Japan didn't have. Now, so far, China has not espoused any imperial ambitions, as Japan once did. And we don't know for sure what will happen. But China will need to secure control over more and more of the world's vital resources, as Lucia suggested. And this will lead to a quasi-imperial Chinese foreign policy, willy-nilly, whether acknowledged or not, whether intentional or not. China is becoming a quasi-imperial power in Africa and Central Asia, now in Latin America, in its pursuit of the raw materials it needs. And so it's becoming increasingly dependent on sea lanes to carry the materials that are vital for its economy, and becoming dependent on these SLOCs, these SLOCs. And so U.S. strategists see a struggle for control of Asian sea lines of communication as the center of gravity of future geopolitical competition between a rising China and a declining the United States, with the South China Sea as ground zero of this contest. So the South China Sea has now been designated by the U.S. government as the most important strategic place on the planet. Why the South China Sea? We could talk more about this if you want me to, but it's an area that's claimed largely by China on the basis of its claim to some islands, the Spratlys and the Paracels. But this area is also claimed, parts of it, by other countries, the Philippines, Vietnam, Malaysia, Indonesia, Brunei, and so it's a contested area. And China's behavior has been rather of a bullying nature. It's used naval force against Vietnam and the Philippines and Malaysia, and it has alienated those countries. And this gives the U.S. a strategic advantage, which Obama and Hillary Clinton are seeking to exploit, posing the U.S. as the rescuer of the Southeast Asian Davids in their struggle against the Chinese Goliath. This is the kind of language they're using in Hawaii at Apec, in Manila when Hillary Clinton was there, in Australia, and using this to acquire bases or reacquire bases in the Philippines, in Singapore, in Australia. We heard about that as well. This was the aim of Obama's trip to the region in November. Also to acquire strategic partners. Now, many of you look like you're of my age, so you'll remember the Vietnam War. It would be inconceivable for me if you told me back then that in 30 or 40 years the U.S. was going to be conducting joint military maneuvers with the Vietnamese Navy in a hypothetical war against China. But that's what the U.S. has been doing. Just this summer. This has very worrisome consequences. China is clearly, Chinese officials are deeply distressed by this. And if you read the Chinese press, you could see signs of their distress over this. They say the Obama trip and these new moves are a threat to stability in the region, are warmongering and all of this. It's clearly thrown them off their balance. It's exposed vulnerabilities in their regional strategy and made them understandably worried about future U.S. intentions. This has these dangerous consequences. China is seeking new allies or bolstering its allies, especially Russia, which is adjacent, so it has interior lines of communication, but Russia is also a major arms supplier to China and a military technology supplier, so China is being moved closer to a quasi-military alliance with Russia. And they cooperate in Central Asia in a sort of alliance against the U.S. And we see this also in the international context where China and Russia are cooperating in a kind of building an anti-American quasi-federation of anti-American powers that includes Syria and Iran and Venezuela and some of the Central Asian countries. Blocking U.S. moves at the United Nations around Syria. I find this deeply worrying and distressing. China is also building up its own navy, understandably, to balance against the increase in American naval power, building up anti-naval warfare capabilities, submarines and the like. And the Chinese, in conducting these moves, claim that they're defensive, which to the outside observer looking up in space, they're not building up their navy off the California coast. The Americans are building up their capabilities in the South China Sea, off the Chinese coast. So when they build up their navy, they view this as a defensive move. But the U.S. views that as a threat to our vital national interests, because our vital national interests extend to the coastline of China. And so when they build up their navy, that's viewed as an offensive move. And this is creating momentum in Washington and the military think tanks and in the right-wing press to say we're not building up the Navy fast enough. We have to expand. China's a new threat to American power, the new threat. And so we're moving into a time of an incipient naval arms race with China, greater suspicion, greater hostility that's developing a momentum of its own. Independent, Obama says that's not what we want. We want to have a constructive relationship with China. But when he adopts this strategy, he has pushed us on a path of confrontation and greater risk of conflict, of unintended incidents at sea that can escalate. And so I fear that the South China Sea is the most dangerous place on the planet because of the risk of naval encounters, unintended escalation of naval events, leading to deeper and deeper hostility and antagonism and suspicion between these two countries, leading to conflict. Not because this is intentional, but because of the nature of the clash between America's determination to assert its power in this crucial region, to contain China, and inevitably China will have to respond, and it's going to set off this chain of events. So, so addressing this matter of naval power is absolutely crucial. So I'll stop there.
Plenty of time for good discussion.
Yeah, I want to, to comment on both, viewpoints, and I think it's a very good one. But I think the China's view, of the world, okay, it would be a very new one, okay, that I think China is trying to look into their history and the matter of socialism and capitalism, and they're trying to shape a new path, for international relationship. Okay, which would be different, I think, from the general classical view of power and so on and so forth. So but what I am curious is, what is your viewpoint in terms of with the South China Sea issues? Okay, there were a lot of questions that supposedly China is bullying its neighbors. I'm curious, what exactly is the situation, because on the other side, I hear a lot from the Chinese press that there are certainly legitimate claims, okay, for those territories, as well as in East China Sea with Japan, okay. So, and I think what China is trying to do is to assert its legitimate claim, okay. That is, they're not, if it is legal and if it is according to international precedent that those places belongs to China, then they're going to fight for it, okay. On the other hand, if there are issues, then I think and I heard something to the effect that China is not willing to submit that to the International Court of Justice. Okay, so I don't know how true that is, since I'm not an expert.
Which one? South China Sea.
Yeah, South China Sea issue as well as overall. I think if China is believe in fairness, okay, they should go to a neutral place where there is no imperialistic design and interests, okay, to settle problems. And I think that's the model that China are moving towards, as long as the international platform is not raped, okay, by the imperialist power, okay? And I think that really is the crux, and I would like a comment on that.
Okay. Yeah, actually, thank you for the question, because that's what I just want to respond there as well. So first, okay, John Mearsheimer, he believes theory is the only thing you can predict the futures. Okay, so if you don't have a theory, you can already predict what is the behavior will stay. But I think I probably agree with him, but I also agree history can sometimes predict the future. So use my theory, what will the Chinese response to this Americans' return to Asia, I think. Recently, the Vice President Xi Jinping, presumably the next president of China, visited the U.S. I noticed that it's the first time the Chinese government made a comment on the U.S. return Asia policy. So he said, I think both, so Pacific Asia is broader enough for both China and the US to develop. This is probably the first time I've heard from the Chinese side how they comment on this. So you see the Chinese say, okay, yes, we are probably not very happy about this, definitely. But if you make the decision and you say you want to return to Asia, then we think it's okay. Right? And then specifically, what is China's South China Sea policies? I think because also what I say is that it's through a learning process, because before probably 1980s, China was excluded from the international society. Right? So China doesn't know how to deal with those issues. So it's also a learning process. You're right, before, and we learned when we were at school that all the South China Sea dispute that belong to us. Right? So even that's part of against the international law. And since China participated more about this international organization, then they learned this norm of international law, they found it's impossible they claim all this territorial dispute. So recently I found a foreign speaker for this foreign ministry. The first time they mentioned China does not intend to claim all this disputed territory in South China Sea. So I think it's a very good start that the Chinese government already realized that when we want to be a responsible great power, then we need to follow some norms and rules.
I think there are precedent in the Burmese negotiation of the
Right.
territory that China did
Right.
give territory
Right.
to
Yes.
Burma.
Yeah, actually.
Okay, to settle
But
the
the
territorial
Chinese
claims.
was not very happy about the Southeast Asian country that aligned with the U.S. to
Yeah,
ask
exactly.
the U.S. stand
That
behind
is
them. I
bullying
think
in a
China,
sense.
China preferred this individual bilateral negotiation with individual state, but U.S. said you cannot do this because you're going to bully them. Right. So I think this is probably the problem there. And also you mentioned this China is probably forming this quasi alliance with Russia. So I think, you see, in the government officials' document or towns, they never say China want an alliance with any other states. Okay, so and I think based on my theory, it's true because China was part of this non-alliance movement. They believe a friend because alliance, I think, for the U.S. doesn't mean these equal relationships. So you can't have an alliance with Pakistan, then you can violate their sovereignty and bomb their territory. So, but friends is sometimes you are more equal, no matter you are small or you are strong. Right? So I think formally China don't really form this alliance. But you mentioned these Syria issues. I think that's maybe a very hot topic. I want to just speak briefly is that the reasons China and Russia they oppose this Syrian resolution is different. Because the Russia has military base in Syria, and they buy this natural gas from Syria. They have tremendous interest there. But none of this exists for the Chinese case. So why the Chinese against this is because the Chinese feel they got fooled by the U.S. and the West in these Libya issues. Because they actually agreed the UN to intervene to stop this humanitarian crisis. Right? But then they didn't know once they agreed is the U.S. and the NATO, they bomb Libya over the next day, right? So they push this regime change. But then the Chinese learned that if we make this, we agree this, then the U.S. can, and the NATO, they can do this again. So they actually oppose unilateral action, make this regime change.
Actually, it's preserving the UN Charter of not intervening into member states.
Right. So I think they both veto it, but they have different causes behind this.
More questions? Over there?
Approximately 2 months ago, Samoa changed, or the Samoa government changed the international deadline from, I am going to say, the east to the west, to be under the same day as China or ASEAN. If the Pacific is going to become, I am going to say, the main gravitational center in this planet in the next century or whatever, do you think this system, and in this case I am talking about the international deadline, is going to be totally transformed and changed there to become more together, to integrate more the Pacific Ocean? What do you think about it, please?
The Americans have a project which Tina laid out, which is to call for a Pacific community of nations which include America's economic allies in Latin America, like Chile in particular, Mexico to some degree, and Peru. So to move the center of gravity of the Pacific towards the United States, and China would of course look at it differently. And I think that U.S. project is kind of a fraud, because that's not going to happen. The center of gravity is the South China Sea, the East China Sea, and the sea lanes that go from there to Africa and the Middle East. However, there's growing interest in the Arctic, because as climate change, which Lucia spoke about, is going to open up potentially a new route from China through to Europe around Russia. And the Chinese are very, very interested in that sea route opening up.
More on that last point, actually, we just recently were given a document that came from the National Development Reform Commission, the agency in China that does planning on these sorts of things. And there's a map that shows basically the shortened shipping lanes that could be achieved in an iceless Arctic. And showing sort of the benefits that China would experience in terms of saving fuel costs by accessing China, San Francisco, also New York, and then also Canadian and European markets going right through, down by Greenland. So it's kind of interesting to see.
Back there.
In the panel that you were in just before this, there was a great deal of discussion about the possibility of war with Iran. And what happens to this Obama doctrine or project of shifting everything to the Pacific Rim if if the government and the state is pulled back again to the Middle East?
Okay, well, Obama doesn't want that to happen.
Yeah.
So he's trying to prevent
But
that
the
from
forces
happening. However, that's the left flank of this arc, and they talk about an arc which begins at the Strait of Hormuz in the Persian Gulf, through the Indian Ocean, south of India, through the Strait of Malacca, and the South China Sea and the East China Sea. This is the area which the U.S. Navy now seeks to dominate from one end to the other. So the Strait of Hormuz will never disappear as as one of the focal points of this new strategy. It won't be the center of it. The center is being moved to the South China Sea. They call it the pivot. They have words for this. They speak of a pivot. The pivot is to move it, the center of gravity, from the Persian Gulf to the South China Sea. But it will remain one of a big part of it. And the war with Iran will be a naval air war. It will not be a ground war. So it's not inconsistent with the new emerging strategy.
Yeah, right there.
Seems to me there might be also another sort of factor in the dynamic, namely the increasing role of other developing countries. For example, China last year hosted a meeting of so-called BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. And I think that they at least call for what's known, what they call a multipolar globalization. And to get away from this two-power confrontation kind of model. And it seems to me that's a good thing, because I think it's time for some of these emerging economies and countries to play a greater role in world affairs. And so I'm just wondering, would any of the panelists see a trend toward more of a role for the other developing countries in some of these issues? Or I'm just wondering about, do you see BRICS having more of a role, or any thoughts about that?
That's something really short. I mean, I think BRIC has definitely had an emerging role on the climate and energy scene, and that China seems to be favorable to this development, moving away from the idea of the G2, the U.S. and China being sort of like the only players on the stage. And I think that that's a good thing. I think with that, there's also been a trend, at least in the climate and sort of the politics of climate change and energy, that to throw the tacky, the difficult issue of climate change away from the UN to more elite organizations like the G20, or you know, sometimes there's even regional organizations that are trying to deal with it, just because the UN has basically failed. So, and I think that's dangerous. So I think going that far is bad, because you know, there needs to be sort of the global democracy. All countries, and the UN is the only place that has sort of that one country, one vote mentality. So I guess there's two different opposing trends there. Well, you know, I'm not really sure which direction we're going in, but away from the G20, but not so extreme that you know, this is being dealt with by a handful of countries behind closed doors.
I have to say I've become more pessimistic in the past year. A year or two ago, I would have said that we were moving towards a more multipolar, cooperative world. And you know, if you look at President Obama's speeches in the first 2 years of his administration, he was a strong supporter of that trend. But he's moved away from that towards a more bipolar world, or rather, as I see it, a world of two competing quasi-alliance systems, the West versus the East, or however you want to put it. And I think that's a combination of the poisonous political atmosphere in Washington, a sense of China's rise being more rapid than anybody anticipated, and that feels threatening. But a lot of it is domestic, the poisonous atmosphere in the United States, for a whole lot of reasons. I think, and so this strategy that he's adopted is more about a response to American weakness than anything else. It's a way to respond to America's decline. But the inevitable result is to push China in a more defensive, threatened environment, which is pushing China, I think, into a more, forcing China to seek allies to balance the U.S., and it's leading to these negative consequences, which I think including China-Russia collaboration at the United Nations and Central Asia through the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which is hardly peaceful or cooperative, and other behaviors as the U.S. also becomes more assertive as well. And you know, we're sort of in the middle of a transition period, and I don't know where all this is going. It may not turn out this way. I don't see the BRICS playing the role that looked more promising a few years ago.
In those groups you mentioned, those countries, I found there are many similarities between China and India, Brazil, and South Africa, except for Russia. So I found those countries, they were all post-colonial countries, right? So they share a lot of similarities, same ideas. I remember the first time when 2 years ago, the Brazilian Chinese president, his first trip was to China, right? And he brought so many business people. One of the aim of the trip is to study how the Chinese manage this state-owned enterprise, because they were fed up about this Washington consensus, asking them to privatize everything in fun. That's wrong. So now we need to learn from the Chinese how to conduct our state-owned economy and gain strength over powers. Also India, here you might think, okay, India is the largest democracy in the world, and the US is really promoting India to balance against China. Recently, I think New York Times, they published a piece saying, why India is becoming more like us, right? So they think, but that's really not the case, because in history, China and India, they were actually quite close, and they have some dispute, yes, but mostly of the case, they were probably now solved by peace, and they can swim this territory. So it's really the U.S. want to set up this model in Asia to say, this is India is the model you need to follow, but that's not what the Indians actually want. You see, recently they have this clash between the Indians and the Americans. I think also similar happened probably in South Africa as well. So, but Russia, I think, exceptional case, because in history, I think the Russian choose to join this break is really because it's decline of its powers. So it needs countries like China and India, but I think China and Russia really don't share too much similarities, and that's my personal opinion.
In the front there.
You know, you mentioned in your talk that China, you know, has is more of a possibility of creating a different kind of approach to energy. And 10 years ago, we lived in China, and I talked to lots of young people and a lot of people about kind of where China was going and what they thought about the pollution, which was evident everywhere. And I was just overwhelmed by the universal desire to have an American lifestyle. That what everybody wanted was to have their own car. China's government at that time was promoting the car industry. And I guess I'm just wondering, I mean, it seemed like such a lost opportunity to develop in a different way. And I'm just wondering if now, where is the pushback? Where is the environmental movement in China? You know, who is promoting a different kind of development, if anybody?
Well, I think there's this idea now that, you know, the new model is sort of, you can have your cake and eat it too, right? So you can, you know, Chinese people can yearn for an American-style lifestyle, and in fact, even have one and have cars, but by using technology, we can use less energy but also live more lavishly, right? And whether or not that's true, I mean, I think basically that's true to a certain degree. It's not completely true. I mean, there are limits, and I think in China, you know, the different model that China offers is the model of central planning and government and very aggressive government investment. That's basically the nuts and bolts of the alternative model. The U.S., you know, hasn't really been able to do that for a variety of reasons. Interest groups having a huge influence in politics and so on. But that model, you know, in China, even in China, I think is eroding. So while I say that there's an opportunity for a new model, I think that the door is also kind of closing on that as well. You know, but that said, I think there is some hope for this idea that, you know, that people can move up you know, have a better quality of life and also use less energy. And China's understood this as sort of setting targets in terms of energy intensity per unit of GDP, so continuing to grow, but not polluting as much as they grow. And this kind of, you know, in a way is a little bit tricky because, you know, the U.S. sets absolute targets. We will reduce our emissions by this much. China says we will reduce it, you know, as a percentage of growth, which is, you know, if this was in dieting terms, that's like saying, you know, the U.S. is saying I will lose X amount of pounds. China is saying I'm going to have my metabolism be faster. You know, it's not concentrating on pounds. So, you know, I think that's kind of what that new model looks like, and I guess we'll have to see sort of how well it can be implemented and if people really can have that lifestyle. And it's not just cars, it's diet and travel as well. I don't know, maybe the two of you or Tina has something else to say about that.
I have a little bit to comment on the conference.
Let me just see if there's other questions, just to be inclusive of everyone, since you've already, sorry, just back there.
Thank you all, because these were great updates and analyses on trade agreements, on climate. But this one's for Michael Clare, which is, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the air dimension.
The what?
The air dimension. The Pentagon described its new, current strategy as air-sea battle.
Yeah.
And command of the air is essentially if you're going to have naval and power projecting capacity. So for two reasons. One is couldn't the atmosphere be the other hotspot with the South China Sea in an arms race to be able to disable the others, basically command of communications and power projection over the Chinese mainland and over the South China Sea. I mean, those of us who are really concerned about, who are trying to, systematically cut military spending and pull back the power projection, that's the main, expense, see this whole new initiative as you know, 2 more generations of expensive weapons development and justification for war. So we're worried about the air dimension too.
Well, actually, I mean, the key expression in the new U.S. defense budget and policy goes by the acronym A2AD.
Yeah.
And that stands for, I have to always remember, anti-access area denial.
Yeah.
And this is a funny notion to get your head around. They claim that the big worry that the U.S. military has is, you know, God forbid that the Chinese want to defend their own territory. They shouldn't be allowed to have this capacity, or any other, you know, adversary, which means anti-access. That is denying us access to their shore, to their coastal areas, and area denial. That is deny us access to them for the purpose of invasion and attack, whether by air or by sea or amphibious landing. So the thrust of the new U.S. strategy, I have it here. I'd love to, maybe I'll even read from it. I have it right here. This is the new strategy. You know, they're very clear. Sustaining U.S. global leadership, priorities for 21st century defense. And they talk about the A squared, and they talk about China as posing a ability to overcome our ability to attack them. So we have to spend all this money on being able to overcome their defensive abilities. And air power is the first wave. Is you have to shoot down their airplanes, and then to be able to attack their radars and their anti-ship missiles and their anti-aircraft missiles. Of course, these are the same weapons that will be attacked in Iran. And they talk about China and Iran. States such as China and Iran will continue to pursue asymmetric means, like submarines, to counter our power projection capabilities, our ability to assault them, while the proliferation of sophisticated weapons, essentially. Accordingly, U.S. military will invest as required to ensure its ability to operate effectively in anti-access and area denial environments. This is what we're spending our tax dollars on, is to be able to invade other countries, even in the face of their desire to defend themselves. So that's what this is all about. And it's a 20th, 19th century form of military dominance and aggressiveness, and I think it's despicable.
That's the bottom line of imperialism.
Yeah, whatever.
Could you cite the reference for that article?
This is not an article. This is the policy of our government.
Well, that's what I mean, policy.
Yeah, it's called Sustaining U.S. Global Leadership, Priorities for 21st Century Defense.
Okay.
U.S. Department of Defense, January 2012. And it begins with a letter from the White House signed by Barack Obama, giving his endorsement.
We're at time. We've already run over 10 minutes. I warmly welcome you to continue the conversation afterwards. Thank you so much for coming out. Thanks for the great discussion. Thanks for having us.
Thank you all very much.